Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of the most chaotic moments in the history of medicine. The Black Death and doctors staring at the problem with the medical equivalent of, well, let's try something. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When the Black Death began tearing through Europe in the 1400s, people desperately tried to understand what was happening. Entire towns emptied. Neighbours disappeared overnight. A person could be healthy in the morning and dead within a few days. Naturally, everyone wanted answers. Unfortunately, medieval medicine was operating without a few key tools. For example, microscopes, bacteria theory, epidemiology, antibiotics, or really any understanding of how infectious disease actually works. So doctors did what humans always do when confronted with a terrifying mystery. They guessed. And the best guess at the time came from something very noticeable: the smell. Medieval cities did not smell great. Streets were full of animal waste, rotting food, open drains, and the occasional dead animal politely decomposing in the corner. When people noticed that sickness often appeared in these environments, the conclusion seemed obvious. Bad smells were causing disease. This idea became known as the miasma theory, the belief that poisonous air spread illness. And once you accept that theory, the solution becomes very clear. If bad smells make you sick, then good smells must protect you. So people began carrying flowers everywhere: lavender, rosemary, sage, thyme. Mint, basically anything that smelled pleasant. Small bouquets were tucked into belts, pockets, hats, or held directly under the nose while walking through the street. Picture an entire city walking around like very nervous gardeners. Wealthier citizens carried decorative metal scent containers called pomanders. These small balls were filled with herbs, spices, and aromatic resins, meant to purify the air before it reached the lungs. In other words, medieval people invented the first wearable air fresheners. The streets of Plague-era Europe must have been an interesting mix of smells: panic, incense, flowers, and probably a stubborn amount of sewage still doing its own thing. And for a brief moment, the strategy seemed comforting. If the air smells nice, maybe the air is safe. Unfortunately, the plague bacterium Yersinia pestis was not particularly impressed by lavender. It continued spreading through fleas living on rats, completely ignoring everyone's carefully curated herbal bouquets. So thousands of people walked through plague-ridden cities clutching flowers under their noses, feeling slightly safer, while bacteria and fleas quietly carried on with their plans. It did absolutely nothing medically. But on the bright side, medieval Europe briefly smelled like a very anxious botanical garden. If there is one image that instantly screams medieval plague, it is the plague doctor mask. Long black robe, gloves, a wide hat, and that unmistakable bird-like beak that makes the doctor look less like a physician and more like a very serious crow attending a medical conference. At first glance, the outfit seems theatrical, almost absurd, but it was actually designed with a very specific medical theory in mind. Once again, the culprit was bad air. Doctors believed the plague spread through poisonous vapours drifting through cities. Rotting bodies, sewage, and disease were all thought to release invisible clouds of toxic air that could enter the body through the nose, which meant protecting the nose became extremely important. Enter the beak. The long mask was packed with herbs and fragrant substances: lavender, mint, camphor, cloves, rose petals, and sometimes vinegar-soaked cloth. As air travelled through the beak before reaching the doctor's face, it would supposedly pass through this aromatic mixture. The pleasant smells would neutralise the poisonous air. At least, that was the theory. In practice, the mask probably did very little to filter disease. But the outfit itself had one accidental advantage. The long coat, gloves, and mask created a physical barrier between the doctor and the patient. Fleas had a harder time biting through thick clothing. and doctors avoided direct skin contact with infected people. Without realizing it, they had stumbled onto a primitive form of protective gear. Not quite modern hazmat suits, but definitely better than walking into plague houses wearing sandals and optimism. The mask also had glass lenses covering the eyes, giving doctors a full head covering. Combined with a wooden staff used to examine patients from a safe distance, plague doctors could inspect victims without getting too close. In other words, medieval doctors accidentally invented social distancing equipment. Of course, the costume still looked absolutely terrifying. Imagine being sick with the plague, feverish and delirious, and suddenly a tall figure dressed like a giant bird walks into the room carrying a stick. Comforting? Probably not. But despite the frightening appearance and questionable herbal filter system, the outfit represents something interesting. Even when their understanding of disease was wrong, medieval doctors were still trying to protect themselves. They just happened to look like extremely concerned ravens while doing it. When medieval doctors encountered a disease, they did not understand which, during the Black Death, was essentially every disease they did not panic. They reached for their most trusted medical solution: remove some blood. This practice was based on the ancient theory of the four humours, a system inherited from Greek physicians like Hippocrates and Galen. According to this belief, the human body contained four vital fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health depended on keeping these fluids in perfect balance. If you became sick, it meant one of the humours had become excessive or corrupted. The logical solution was to remove the offending fluid and restore harmony to the body. And since blood was the easiest humour to access, bloodletting became the go-to treatment for almost everything. Headache? Remove blood. Fever? Remove blood. Strange mysterious plague that is killing half the continent? You guessed it. Remove blood. Doctors used small knives called lancets to open a vein, allowing blood to flow into bowls or cloths. Sometimes they used leeches, which were essentially tiny professional blood removal specialists with excellent work ethic and zero bedside conversation. The amount of blood removed depended on the doctor's judgment, which could vary widely. Some patients lost small amounts, others lost quite a lot. Unfortunately, plague victims were already extremely weak. The disease caused fever, dehydration, and severe infection. Their bodies were fighting desperately to survive. Removing blood did not restore balance. It mostly made patients weaker, dizzy, and even less capable of resisting the infection. But the treatment continued anyway, because within the medical logic of the time, it made perfect sense. If illness meant imbalance, draining blood looked like active treatment rather than helpless waiting. And doing something always feels better than doing nothing. From the doctor's perspective, bloodletting showed effort. It looked scientific. It followed established medical tradition that had been respected for centuries. Unfortunately, bacteria are not very impressed by tradition. So, while doctors carefully balanced humours and filled bowls with blood, the plague bacterium continued spreading quietly through flea bites and infected rodents. Bloodletting did not cure the plague, but it did give medieval medicine one of its most famous and persistent treatments. If something was wrong, remove blood. If that did not work, remove more. It was, in many ways, the medieval version of restarting a malfunctioning machine and hoping for the best. If medieval doctors had a second favourite cure after bloodletting, it was vinegar. Lots of vinegar. Barrels of vinegar. Enough vinegar that an entire city might briefly smell like an overenthusiastic salad. The reasoning, again, came from the miasma theory, the belief that disease spread through poisonous air and corrupt vapours. Since vinegar had a strong, sharp smell and was known to clean certain surfaces, many physicians believed it could neutralise plague toxins. If bad air caused illness, vinegar might purify it. So doctors began recommending vinegar for almost everything related to the plague. People washed their hands with vinegar. They wiped down furniture with vinegar. They soaked cloths in vinegar and held them to their faces while walking through the streets. Some even bathed in it. Imagine already having a high fever, swollen lymph nodes, and severe exhaustion, and then someone tells you the next step in your treatment is to take a vinegar bath. Comforting is not the first word that comes to mind. To be fair, vinegar does have mild antimicrobial properties. It can kill certain bacteria on surfaces, and in a few limited situations, it might have reduced some minor infections. But the plague bacterium was not politely waiting on someone's clothing or table. It was already inside the body. Once infected, a vinegar bath did absolutely nothing to stop the disease. Still, the treatment remained popular because it felt scientific. It involved cleaning, purification, and a visible action that people could take to protect themselves. And during a terrifying epidemic, visible action matters. People desperately want something they can do, something they can control, even if that control involves marinating themselves like a medieval pickle. Some plague doctors even recommended mixing vinegar with herbs and spices to create stronger cleansing solutions. These mixtures were sprinkled around homes, burned in rooms, or used to wash floors. Did it stop the plague? No. Did it at least make cities smell slightly less terrible than usual? Possibly, which might be the closest medieval medicine came to a partial success in this particular case. Now we arrive at one of the more unusual chapters of medieval medicine, and that is saying something. During the Black Death, many plague victims developed painful swellings called buboes. These lumps appeared in the groin, armpits, or neck, and could grow to the size of an egg, or even an apple. They were swollen lymph nodes filled with infection, and they were one of the most visible and frightening symptoms of the disease. Naturally, doctors wanted to remove the poison inside them. But without surgery, antibiotics, or any real understanding of infection, they had to get creative, very creative. Some physicians recommended placing a live frog directly on the swollen bubo. Yes, an actual frog. The idea was that the frog would somehow draw the poison out of the patient's body. In certain versions of the treatment, the frog was tied to the infected area and left there until it died. At that point, the poison was believed to have transferred from the patient into the frog, which, from a scientific perspective, is not how biology works. But from the perspective of medieval medicine, the idea was not completely random. There was a long tradition of transference cures treatments that attempted to move illness from a human body into another object or animal. The disease had to go somewhere. So why not the frog? Other animals were sometimes used in similar treatments. Pigeons, chickens, and even slices of raw meat were occasionally applied to plague sores in hopes that the infection would transfer away from the patient. Of course, what usually happened instead was that the frog became extremely uncomfortable while the infection remained exactly where it was. Plague bacteria are stubborn like that. Still, the frog cure shows how desperate people had become. When a disease is killing thousands and no one understands why, people will try almost anything, even amphibian-based medicine. And for the frogs involved, the Black Death must have been a very confusing historical event. One moment you are living peacefully near a pond. The next moment someone decides you are a medical device. Unfortunately for both the patient and the frog, the plague continued spreading just as efficiently as before. But medieval medicine had officially entered the experimental phase, and it was only going to get stranger from here. When medieval medicine ran out of herbs, animals, and blood to experiment with, some physicians turned to something even more luxurious: gemstones. Yes, actual jewels. In the medieval worldview, precious stones were believed to possess powerful natural properties. Emeralds, rubies, sapphires, and other gems were thought to contain hidden forces capable of influencing health, purity, and spiritual balance. After all, if a stone was rare, beautiful, and extremely expensive, surely it must also have magical healing abilities. That was the logic. Some medical texts from the period recommended grinding emeralds into powder and mixing the dust with water or wine. The patient would then drink the mixture in hopes that the purity and power of the gemstone would neutralize the plague poison inside the body. From the physician's perspective, the idea made a certain kind of sense. Precious stones symbolized perfection. They did not rot, decay, or corrode easily. If the plague represented corruption in the body, Perhaps the incorruptible nature of a gemstone could counteract it. Unfortunately, the human digestive system does not treat powdered emeralds as medicine. It treats them as tiny pieces of rock. Drinking crushed gemstones likely did nothing except irritate the stomach and possibly damage teeth. It also had the minor side effect of being extremely expensive, which meant this particular cure was mostly available to the wealthy. Poor peasants might have had to settle for herbs or frogs, but if you were rich enough, you could fight the plague by literally drinking your jewelry. This created one of the more ironic moments in medical history. Some of the most expensive treatments available were also among the least effective. But again, the motivation was understandable. In a world without microscopes, antibiotics, or knowledge of bacteria, people searched for solutions in the materials they believed contained special power. Rare things must be strong. Valuable things must be healing. And when doctors were watching entire cities collapse under a disease they could not control, even crushed emeralds began to sound like a reasonable gamble. The plague bacterium, meanwhile, remained completely unimpressed by the financial value of its victim's dinner. Another popular medieval theory about the plague focused on temperature. Many physicians believed the disease was caused by cold, damp air that had become corrupted. If the body was weakened by this unhealthy atmosphere, the logical cure would be to restore warmth and dryness. So doctors began recommending heat. Lots of heat. Patients were instructed to sit close to large fires for long periods of time. Homes were heated aggressively, windows kept shut, and rooms filled with warm air in hopes that the heat would destroy the plague's poisonous influence. In extreme cases, some physicians even suggested patients stay in very hot rooms or bathhouses, sweating heavily so the disease could be driven out of the body. The logic was simple. If illness came from the environment, changing the environment might force it away. Unfortunately, plague victims already suffered from severe fever. Their bodies were burning with infection, their lymph nodes swollen, and their energy rapidly draining. Placing someone with a raging fever next to a roaring fire was not exactly ideal medical care. In fact, it probably made them feel significantly worse. But medieval medicine often relied on balancing opposites. Cold illness required heat. Wet conditions required dryness. Everything followed a kind of philosophical symmetry rather than biological evidence. And once again, there was a tiny accidental element of truth hidden inside the mistake. Fleas, which carried the plague bacteria, do not thrive in extremely hot environments. High temperatures can reduce flea activity and reproduction. But medieval people were not heating their homes enough to eliminate fleas entirely. They were simply creating extremely uncomfortable living rooms. So patients sat sweating beside fireplaces, believing the heat was driving the plague out of their bodies, while the real cause of the disease continued spreading through flea bites and infected rodents. Still, the treatment gave people something to do. And when an invisible disease is killing people all around you, doing something, however uncomfortable, can feel better than doing nothing at all. Even if that something involves slowly roasting yourself like a medieval chestnut. If medieval medicine had a category that felt slightly more reasonable than frogs, gemstones, and vinegar baths, it was herbs. For centuries, plants had been used as medicine. Monasteries grew medicinal gardens, and herbal knowledge passed down through generations of healers. So when the plague arrived, it was only natural that doctors turned to plants for answers. The difference was that now they were trying to stop one of the deadliest diseases in human history. Some of the most commonly recommended herbs included garlic, sage, rue, angelica root, wormwood, and thyme. These were boiled into strong drinks, crushed into pastes, or eaten directly. Physicians believed certain herbs had the power to cleanse the body of poison, or strengthen the patient's natural defenses. Garlic in particular became extremely popular. Medieval doctors believed garlic could purify the blood and protect the heart. People were advised to eat it raw, mix it into medicinal tonics, or carry it around as protection. Which meant that during the plague, European cities probably smelled strongly of both herbs and garlic. From a medical standpoint, herbal treatments were not entirely irrational. Some plants do contain compounds with antibacterial or anti-inflammatory properties. Garlic, for example, has mild antimicrobial effects. The problem was that these effects were nowhere near powerful enough to stop Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the plague. Drinking herbal mixtures might soothe the stomach or slightly strengthen a person already recovering, but it did nothing to eliminate the infection once it took hold. Still, herbal remedies remained one of the more comforting options available. At the very least, drinking warm herbal broth felt less alarming than tying a frog to your neck. Herbal medicine also gave people a sense of participation in their own recovery. Families gathered plants, prepared mixtures, and followed instructions from local healers. It created routine during a time when daily life had become terrifyingly unpredictable. Of course, the plague did not particularly care about sage or wormwood, but in a world without antibiotics, microscopes, or germ theory, herbs represented the closest thing medieval people had to a pharmacy. And when half the population is searching for hope, even a cup of bitter garlic tea can start to look like a medical breakthrough. At this point in medieval medicine, the cures begin to move from questionable into truly alarming. One treatment recommended in certain medical texts involved applying human waste directly to plague sores. Yes, exactly what it sounds like. To understand why anyone would suggest this, we have to return once again to the medieval idea of disease as poison inside the body. Many physicians believed the swollen buboes of the plague were pockets of toxic matter that needed to be drawn out. The goal of treatment was to pull that poison away from the body, and medieval doctors believed strong smells had the power to attract or absorb harmful substances. So if plague poison needed to be drawn out, what substance had the strongest smell available? Unfortunately, someone concluded the answer was human waste. The theory suggested that placing it directly on the infected swelling might somehow attract the poison out of the body, transferring the illness away from the patient. From a modern perspective, this is almost the opposite of good medical practice. Human waste carries bacteria and pathogens that can easily infect open wounds. Instead of healing the sore, this treatment likely increased the risk of additional infections. But medieval doctors were working with very limited knowledge. They did not understand germs, contamination, or bacterial spread. Instead, they relied heavily on symbolic reasoning. Bad illness required strong remedies. If something smelled powerful enough, perhaps it could overpower the disease. This approach was not unique to the plague. Medieval medicine often used substances with strong odors, believing that smell itself had a cleansing or purifying effect on the body. Of course, in the case of plague sores, the result was probably unpleasant for everyone involved. The patient suffered through a treatment that did nothing to stop the disease, and the doctor had to maintain professional confidence while recommending it, which must have been a challenging moment in bedside manner. Still, this bizarre remedy reflects something important about the era. People were desperate. The Black Death was killing entire communities, and medical knowledge was nowhere near advanced enough to explain it. When confronted with an invisible enemy, physicians reached for any method that seemed even remotely logical. Even if that method involved substances, most modern doctors would prefer never to discuss again. If applying unpleasant substances to the outside of the body did not sound promising enough, medieval medicine also experimented with drinking certain liquids believed to have healing properties. One of those liquids was urine. Yes, human urine. Urine therapy was not invented during the Black Death. It had existed in various medical traditions for centuries. Some ancient physicians believed urine contained useful substances because it came directly from the body's internal processes. If the body produced it, the reasoning went, it must contain something beneficial. So during the plague, some healers recommended drinking urine or applying it to wounds as a cleansing treatment. The idea was that urine might flush toxins from the body or neutralize the poison believed to cause the disease. To modern readers, this sounds like a medical strategy developed during a very long and very confusing afternoon. But in the medieval world, it had a certain kind of logic. Doctors frequently examined urine to diagnose illness. The colour, smell, and clarity of a patient's urine were believed to reveal important information about their health. Entire diagnostic charts existed describing what different shades of urine supposedly meant. If urine could reveal disease, Perhaps it could also help cure it. Unfortunately, drinking it offered no protection against the plague bacterium. Urine is mostly water with small amounts of salts and waste products filtered by the kidneys. While it is generally sterile when leaving the body, it does not contain magical healing compounds capable of defeating bacterial infections. And once someone was already sick with plague, drinking urine certainly did not improve their situation. Still, this treatment shows how medieval medicine often relied on the idea of recycling the body's own substances to restore balance. If illness meant something inside had gone wrong, perhaps the body itself held the key to correcting it. Of course, when the real problem is a bacterium carried by fleas on rats, the solution unfortunately does not come from the bladder. But in the middle of a devastating pandemic, people were willing to try almost anything. Even remedies that modern medicine would politely classify under the category of absolutely not. Not all medieval plague cures involved strange potions or questionable medical procedures. Some involved eliminating what people believed were the source of the disease. And unfortunately, one of the biggest victims of this misunderstanding was the humble cat. During the plague years, many Europeans believed animals were spreading the sickness. In particular, cats were often viewed with suspicion. They had long been associated with witchcraft, bad luck, and supernatural forces, especially black cats. So when the Black Death appeared, it was not difficult for frightened communities to connect the two. Cats must be spreading the plague. Cities and villages began killing large numbers of them. Sometimes the practice was encouraged by local authorities, and in some cases it was reinforced by religious superstition that linked cats with evil or demonic influence. From the perspective of people living in terror of an invisible disease, this action probably felt logical. If an animal might carry the illness, removing the animal might stop the disease. Unfortunately, this decision had the exact opposite effect. Cats are natural predators of rats, and rats were the primary hosts for the fleas carrying Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the plague. When large numbers of cats were killed, rat populations faced far fewer predators, which meant more rats. More rats meant more fleas, and more fleas meant more opportunities for the plague to spread to humans. In other words, the attempt to stop the disease actually helped it expand. This tragic misunderstanding highlights one of the greatest challenges people faced during the medieval period. Without scientific knowledge of bacteria, parasites, or disease transmission, communities relied on observation, superstition, and rumor to explain what was happening. Sometimes those explanations led to actions that made the situation worse. The cats, of course, had no idea they were being blamed for a global pandemic. One moment they were quietly doing their usual job of hunting rodents. The next moment, they had become suspects in the most terrifying medical mystery of the Middle Ages. Meanwhile, the real culprits, fleas living on rats, continued spreading the plague almost entirely unnoticed. And history would later look back at the mass killing of cats as one of the more unfortunate misunderstandings of the entire pandemic. Not everyone believed the plague was a medical problem. Many believed it was a spiritual one. During the Black Death, countless people interpreted the pandemic as divine punishment. Europe in the 1400s was a deeply religious society, and when a disaster of this scale appeared, the explanation seemed obvious to many. Humanity had sinned, and God was angry. If the plague was punishment, then the cure must be repentance. This belief gave rise to one of the most dramatic movements of the plague years, the flagellants. Flagellants were groups of men who travelled from town to town, performing public acts of penance. They marched through streets wearing robes, chanting prayers, and whipping themselves with leather cords or chains. The idea was simple. If people showed enough suffering and repentance, God might forgive humanity and stop the plague. Entire crowds sometimes gathered to watch these rituals. Participants would beat themselves until their backs were bleeding, believing their pain would atone for the sins of society. From a modern medical perspective, this obviously did nothing to stop the plague bacterium. In fact, it may have made things worse. Flagellant groups travelled constantly between cities and villages. Large gatherings formed wherever they arrived, crowds packed into streets to watch or participate. All of this created perfect conditions for disease transmission. People standing close together, traveling long distances, and interacting with multiple communities were unknowingly helping the plague move even faster across Europe. There was also another problem. Church authorities eventually grew uncomfortable with the movement. The flagellants often operated outside official religious control, forming their own travelling religious groups and sometimes criticising established clergy. By the mid-1400s, the Catholic Church began discouraging and even banning flagellant gatherings. But for many people living in fear, the appeal of the movement was understandable. When science cannot explain a disaster, people turn to belief, and belief can feel powerful. Whipping the plague away may not have stopped the disease, but it gave frightened communities something they desperately wanted, a sense that they could still influence their fate. Even if the plague bacterium, quietly riding fleas across the continent, was paying absolutely no attention. When medieval doctors ran out of herbs, frogs, vinegar, and blood to experiment with, some turned their attention upward, to the sky. Astrology played a surprisingly large role in medieval medicine. Physicians of the time believed that the positions of the planets could influence events on Earth, including human health. The movements of celestial bodies were thought to affect everything from weather patterns to bodily fluids. So naturally, when the plague appeared, many scholars began checking the stars. One widely circulated explanation claimed the Black Death had been triggered by a rare planetary alignment involving Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars. According to certain astrologers, this cosmic configuration had corrupted the air itself, creating the poisonous atmosphere responsible for the disease. In other words, the plague was not caused by fleas or bacteria. It was caused by a very unfortunate horoscope. Once the theory spread, medical advice started, including astrological instructions. Some doctors recommended avoiding specific activities on certain days, depending on the positions of the planets. Others advised patients to take medicines only at particular times when the stars were considered favourable. If Mars was influencing the body's blood, perhaps you should not perform bloodletting that day. If Saturn was dominant, maybe avoid certain foods. Entire treatment schedules were built around planetary charts. From the medieval perspective, this made sense. Astrology had been respected for centuries and was often taught alongside medicine at universities. Many physicians genuinely believed that the human body mirrored the structure of the cosmos. The heavens and the body were connected. Unfortunately, the plague bacterium had no interest in planetary movements. It continued spreading through fleas carried by rats, quietly ignoring the positions of Saturn and Jupiter. Still, astrology gave people something they desperately wanted during the pandemic: an explanation. The stars offered order in a world that suddenly felt chaotic. If a cosmic alignment had caused the plague, perhaps another alignment would eventually end it. Of course, the real solution would come centuries later with the discovery of bacteria and modern epidemiology. But during the Black Death, many people spent long nights studying the sky, hoping the next planetary movement might finally bring relief. The plague, meanwhile, remained stubbornly grounded on Earth. When medicine failed, people turned to magic. Throughout medieval Europe, many believed the plague could be kept away with amulets, charms, and protective objects worn on the body. These small items were supposed to shield the wearer from the poisonous forces believed to cause the disease. The charms came in many forms. Some were small metal pendants engraved with prayers or religious symbols. Others were tiny containers filled with herbs, powdered stones, or mysterious substances whose exact ingredients were sometimes known only to the person selling them. A popular version involved wearing parchment scrolls around the neck, containing sacred verses or protective words. The idea was that divine protection could block the plague before it reached the body. In a world where faith and daily life were deeply connected, this seemed perfectly reasonable. If disease was a spiritual threat, spiritual protection might help. Other charms were more unusual. Some people carried pieces of dried toad, snakeskin, or fragments of animal bone, believing these objects held natural powers that could repel illness. And of course, there were the professional charm makers. During the plague years, certain individuals claimed they could create special talismans capable of protecting entire households. These objects were sometimes sold for high prices to desperate families looking for any chance of survival. Whether the charms contained herbs, prayers, or mysterious powders, they all promised the same thing: protection. The real effectiveness of these amulets, unfortunately, was zero. The plague bacterium did not stop to examine jewelry before infecting someone. But the popularity of these objects reveals something deeply human about the medieval response to the pandemic. When a threat is invisible and uncontrollable, people search for something tangible they can carry, something they can hold, something that makes them feel less vulnerable. An amulet may not stop a disease, but it can reduce fear. And during the Black Death, fear was everywhere. People watched neighbours fall sick without warning. Entire families disappeared. Cities emptied. In such a world, even the smallest symbol of protection could bring comfort. So countless people walked through plague-ridden streets wearing charms around their necks, hoping the object resting against their chest might be enough to keep death away. The plague, unfortunately, remained unimpressed. After frogs, gemstones, vinegar baths, bloodletting, astrology, charms, and various other creative experiments, it turns out that the most effective medieval response to the plague was also the simplest. Stay away from sick people. It sounds obvious today, but in the 1400s, this idea was revolutionary. Medieval medicine focused on balancing humours, purifying air, or removing poison from the body. The concept that disease could spread directly from person to person was not widely accepted. Yet some cities began noticing a pattern. When ships arrived from infected ports, new outbreaks often followed. When travellers brought goods from plague-ridden regions, sickness soon appeared in nearby towns. Slowly, authorities began experimenting with a new strategy: isolation. One of the earliest and most famous examples occurred in the city of Venice. Officials ordered that ships arriving from infected areas must remain anchored outside the harbour for a set period of time before passengers could disembark. Originally, the waiting period was 30 days. Later, it was extended to 40 days. This practice became known as quarantine, from the Italian word quaranta meaning 40. If someone aboard the ship was sick, the disease would reveal itself during the waiting period. If no symptoms appeared, the passengers could enter the city. It was not perfect, but it helped. Cities that adopted quarantine measures sometimes slowed the spread of infection. Limiting contact between people reduced opportunities for fleas, rats, and contaminated goods to carry the plague into new communities. Without understanding bacteria, medieval authorities had stumbled onto one of the most powerful tools in disease control: distance. Of course, quarantine was difficult to enforce. Trade slowed, travel became complicated, people resisted restrictions that disrupted daily life. Sound familiar? But compared with the other cures circulating at the time, isolation actually had measurable effects. It did not eliminate the plague entirely, but it saved lives. In the end, the Black Death gradually faded not because of frogs, herbs, charms, or crushed emeralds. It faded because populations developed partial immunity. Public health practices slowly improved, and societies began learning the value of separating the sick from the healthy. Sometimes the most effective medical breakthrough is not a potion or a ritual. Sometimes it is simply stepping back and giving a disease fewer chances to spread. Not glamorous, but remarkably effective. The Silk Road was never a single road. It was a sprawling network of dusty caravan trails, stretching across deserts, mountains, and endless steppe. From the imperial cities of China to the markets of Persia and the ports of the Mediterranean, these routes carried some of the most valuable cargo on earth. Silk, of course, gave the road its famous name. But the caravans transported far more than shimmering fabric. There were sacks of pepper and cinnamon worth their weight in silver, jade carvings wrapped carefully in cloth, Persian carpets rolled tightly onto camel saddles, glassware from Roman workshops, ivory, incense, turquoise, paper, lacquerware, and sometimes even rare animals meant as gifts for kings. Each caravan represented a moving fortune, and fortunes have a way of attracting attention. Travel along the Silk Road was brutally slow. A camel caravan rarely moved faster than 3 or 4 miles an hour. Days stretched into weeks. Weeks stretched into months. The route from China to the Middle East could take an entire year if weather, politics, and survival all cooperated. Unfortunately, survival did not always cooperate. Between oasis towns lay vast stretches of wilderness where no empire truly ruled. The Taklamakan Desert alone swallowed entire caravans beneath shifting dunes. Mountain passes froze travellers in sudden blizzards. Water sources dried up without warning. But nature was not the only danger. Human predators waited too. Bandits studied the caravan routes carefully. They knew which passes were narrow, which valleys were isolated, and which stretches of desert left travellers exhausted and vulnerable. A heavily loaded caravan could not run. Camels were strong, but they were not exactly built for high-speed escape. When raiders struck, it often happened fast. A cloud of dust on the horizon, riders appearing over a ridge, arrows cutting through the dry desert air. Within minutes, a peaceful trade expedition could turn into chaos. Merchants understood this risk very well. No one crossed Central Asia alone unless they had a death wish and a very poor business plan. So caravans organized themselves into massive traveling groups. 50 camels became 200. A handful of traders became an entire mobile community of merchants, servants, cooks, translators, animal handlers, and most importantly, guards. Because on the Silk Road, wealth did not belong to the smartest merchant. It belonged to the caravan that could survive the journey. Merchants along the Silk Road quickly learned a simple rule. Wealth attracts violence. A caravan carrying silk and spices was essentially a moving treasure chest, wandering through thousands of miles of lawless territory. And treasure chests have a tendency to inspire very creative robbery attempts. So merchants did what wealthy people throughout history have always done when faced with danger. They hired professionals. Caravan guards were not ordinary travelers. These men were experienced fighters who understood desert warfare, mounted combat, and the unpleasant reality that sometimes negotiations with bandits ended in arrows rather than polite conversation. A large caravan might hire anywhere from 10 to 50 guards, depending on the value of the cargo and the reputation of the route ahead. Some were former soldiers who had grown tired of imperial campaigns but still enjoyed earning money with a sword. Others were steppe riders from nomadic tribes who knew the terrain better than any map could show. And some were simply men who had discovered that guarding rich merchants paid significantly better than farming barley. Their equipment reflected the brutal environment they operated in. Most guards rode horses rather than camels, allowing them to move faster if trouble appeared. They carried curved sabres ideal for mounted fighting, short bows for ranged attacks, and sometimes spears for charging enemies. Leather armour was common, as heavy metal armour became unbearable under the desert sun. But their most valuable weapon was not steel. It was experience. A seasoned guard could read the land like a book. A distant plume of dust might signal another caravan, or a group of riders trying to approach unnoticed. Fresh hoofprints near a water source might suggest scouts watching from nearby hills. Even silence could be suspicious. If a valley suddenly felt too quiet, it often meant someone was waiting. Caravan guards also worked closely with scouts who rode ahead of the main caravan. These men searched for safe routes, checked water sources, and watched for ambush points where bandits might hide behind rocks or sand dunes. At night, guards took turns patrolling the camp. Fires burned low to avoid attracting attention, and the camels were arranged in tight circles to prevent thieves from slipping in and stealing valuable animals. Because losing a camel was not just inconvenient. Each camel carried goods worth a small fortune, and if bandits managed to steal several camels during the night, a merchant could watch an entire year of profit quietly disappear into the darkness of the desert. If caravan guards were the shield of the Silk Road, Bandits were its constant shadow. These raiders were not always ragged criminals hiding behind rocks waiting for luck. Many were highly organized groups who understood the caravan trade just as well as the merchants themselves. Some had once been caravan workers, camel drivers, or even guards who decided that stealing the cargo paid far better than protecting it. After all, why earn a guard's salary when you could take the entire caravan? Bandits came from many different backgrounds. Some were nomadic tribes living along the trade routes who saw caravans as convenient moving tax collectors that had forgotten to ask permission. Others were displaced soldiers from collapsed empires, men trained in warfare but suddenly unemployed. History tends to produce quite a few of those. In the deserts of Central Asia, some bandit groups operated almost like small armies. They had scouts watching key routes, hidden camps near oasis towns, and networks of informants who reported when wealthy caravans were preparing to depart. Information was often their most valuable weapon. A merchant caravan carrying ordinary cloth and grain might not attract much interest, but a caravan rumoured to be carrying Chinese silk, Persian silver, or precious stones from India was a very different matter. Those caravans could tempt entire raiding parties. Bandits preferred ambushes rather than open battles. Fighting a well-armed caravan head-on was risky. Guards were hired specifically to kill people who tried that sort of thing. Instead, raiders looked for narrow passes, dry riverbeds, or steep desert ridges where they could attack quickly and vanish before the caravan could organize a defense. Speed was everything. Most bandits rode fast horses that could outmaneuver heavily loaded camels. They struck suddenly, aiming to create panic. Arrows would rain down first, targeting guards and camel drivers. Then riders would charge into the confusion, cutting ropes and driving away camels loaded with goods. They did not need to steal everything. Just a few camels packed with silk could make a bandit rich. And once the loot was taken, the raiders disappeared into the desert or mountains, where pursuit became nearly impossible. Guards could try to chase them, but a caravan could not simply abandon its cargo and wander across unknown terrain. The desert had a way of swallowing people who made reckless decisions. So the Silk Road became a constant game of strategy. Merchants tried to stay alive long enough to reach the next city. Bandits tried to make sure some of them never did. Bandits along the Silk Road understood something very important about caravans. They were slow, predictable, and extremely valuable. This made them ideal targets, but only if the attack was planned carefully. A careless assault could end badly. Caravan guards were often experienced fighters, and merchants were not shy about defending fortunes worth years of trade. If bandits rushed in without preparation, they could quickly find themselves facing organized resistance rather than terrified merchants. So the most successful raiders relied on patience. Ambushes usually began long before the caravan even arrived. Scouts watched the trade routes from distant hills or rocky outcrops. They studied how many guards rode with the merchants, how large the caravan was, and whether the travellers appeared disciplined or careless. A caravan with 30 guards required a different plan than one with 5. Once the bandits understood their target, they chose the terrain carefully. Narrow mountain passes were favourites because caravans had little room to manoeuvre. Desert ravines worked well too, especially if high cliffs allowed archers to fire downward. Even dried riverbeds could become deadly traps if riders were hidden behind ridges on both sides. The goal was simple: strike where escape was difficult. The attack itself was usually sudden and terrifying. Imagine the caravan moving slowly through a quiet valley. Camels groaning under heavy loads. Merchants talking lazily about profits they had not yet earned. Then arrows appear out of nowhere. The first volley often targeted the guards and camel drivers. Without drivers, the animals panicked. Camels were not brave creatures by nature. Once frightened, they bellowed loudly and tried to scatter in every direction, dragging valuable cargo with them. Chaos was exactly what the bandits wanted. As confusion spread, mounted raiders charged in from hidden positions. Their goal was rarely to destroy the caravan completely. That would take too long and risk unnecessary casualties. Instead, they focused on cutting ropes, seizing the most valuable camels and escaping before the guards could regain control. A skilled raiding party could strike and vanish within minutes. Sometimes the attack worked perfectly. Bandits rode away laughing with silk bundles, silver coins, and spices worth fortunes in distant markets. Other times, however, the caravan guards were ready. And when prepared fighters met determined bandits in the middle of the desert, the Silk Road could turn into a battlefield filled with arrows, steel, and very angry camels. When caravans stopped for the night along the Silk Road, they did not simply scatter their animals across the desert and hope for the best. That would have been an excellent way to wake up in the morning with fewer camels, fewer goods, and possibly fewer merchants. Instead, experienced caravan leaders turned their camps into temporary fortresses. As evening approached and the sun dipped behind the desert hills, the caravan slowly began its nightly ritual. Camels were unloaded and guided into a tight circular formation. Hundreds of animals might be arranged shoulder to shoulder, creating a living wall of fur, legs, and extremely grumpy attitudes. It was not elegant, but it worked. Inside this ring of camels, the merchants and workers set up their camp. Tents were pitched, cooking fires were lit carefully, and the precious cargo was stacked where it could be watched. Guards walked the perimeter, checking ropes and watching the dark horizon. The camels themselves served as the first line of defense. A thief trying to sneak into the camp would quickly discover that camels are not quiet creatures. They snort, groan, and complain loudly about almost everything. If someone unfamiliar moved through the herd at night, the animals would often start making noise, alerting the guards before the thief could escape with anything valuable. It was an alarm system that ran entirely on bad temper and chewing. Guards also organized strict watch rotations. Throughout the night, pairs of armed riders patrolled the edge of the camp, moving silently between shadows. Some carried bows ready for quick shots. Others held spears or sabers in case the threat came closer. Meanwhile, scouts sometimes rode short distances away from the caravan to observe nearby terrain. A group of bandits might attempt to approach quietly under cover of darkness, hoping to steal a few camels without starting a full battle. But stealing a camel was not a simple task. A loaded camel could carry hundreds of pounds of silk, spices, or silver. That meant even a single animal might represent months of profit for a merchant. Losing just 3 or 4 camels during the night could financially cripple an entire expedition, which meant guards stayed alert. Because while the desert nights were cold and quiet, everyone in the camp understood one uncomfortable truth. Somewhere beyond the firelight, someone else might be watching the caravan and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Banditry along the Silk Road was not always random violence. In many cases, it was a calculated business model. Caravans carried extraordinary wealth across enormous distances. A single camel loaded with Chinese silk could be worth a small fortune in Persian markets. Spices from India, such as pepper or cinnamon, could sell for several times their purchase price once they reached the Mediterranean. Even ordinary goods like fine glass, paper, or lacquerware could bring large profits in distant cities where such items were rare. To a merchant, this was opportunity. To a bandit, it was an invitation. Raiding caravans became a way to acquire luxury goods without participating in the exhausting months-long journey that legitimate trade required. Instead of spending a year crossing deserts and mountains, a bandit could attempt to seize the cargo in a matter of minutes. Of course, this approach came with a rather obvious risk. Caravan guards tended to object strongly to being robbed. Still, for many groups living along remote stretches of the Silk Road, banditry was a practical way of surviving. Some tribes lived in harsh landscapes where farming was nearly impossible. Raiding caravans provided goods they could trade, consume, or sell through local black markets. Stolen silk might be exchanged for horses. Silver coins could buy weapons. Spices could be sold quietly to merchants in distant towns who asked very few questions about where the goods originally came from. And many merchants did not ask. Trade networks across Central Asia were complex and often loosely regulated. A bolt of silk might pass through 5 or 6 hands before reaching its final buyer. By the time the fabric appeared in a Persian bazaar or a Byzantine marketplace, no one could easily prove whether it had been purchased legally or taken during a midnight raid in the desert. This made stolen goods surprisingly easy to resell. Some bandit groups even developed partnerships with corrupt traders who specialized in moving stolen cargo. These middlemen helped convert looted goods into cash or supplies, allowing raiders to prepare for future attacks. It was, in many ways, a shadow economy running alongside legitimate trade. Caravans carried wealth from one empire to another. Bandits intercepted some of that wealth along the way. And while merchants complained bitterly about the dangers of the road, the truth was simple. As long as caravans continued to carry enormous fortunes through empty deserts, there would always be someone waiting nearby who preferred robbery to honest work. Not all caravan guards were simple hired swords wandering from job to job. Some were highly respected mercenaries whose reputations travelled almost as far as the caravans they protected. In fact, experienced caravan leaders often chose their guards very carefully. Hiring cheap fighters might save money at the beginning of a journey, but it could cost everything if bandits attacked. So wealthy merchants looked for professionals. Many of the most feared guards came from the nomadic peoples of Central Asia. Steppe riders had spent their entire lives on horseback. From childhood, they learned to shoot arrows at full gallop, guide horses across rough terrain, and survive in landscapes that outsiders considered nearly impossible to cross. To them, the deserts and plains of the Silk Road were home. These riders made excellent caravan guards because they could react quickly if danger appeared. Their horses were faster than camels, allowing them to chase raiders or scout ahead of the caravan. Their bows could fire accurately from long distances, which meant they could strike enemies before those enemies reached the merchants. And most importantly, they understood the tactics of other nomadic raiders. A steppe rider guarding a caravan could often predict how bandits might attack. They knew which mountain passes were likely ambush points. They recognized the signs of hidden camps. Sometimes they even recognized rival tribes, simply from the style of horse tracks or the shape of arrows left behind after an attack. It was a strange situation. Many caravan guards came from the same cultural world as the bandits they fought. The difference was money. Serving as a caravan guard could be extremely profitable. Merchants paid well for protection, especially if their cargo included silk, silver, or gemstones. Guards might receive wages, food, equipment, and sometimes even a share of captured loot if they successfully defeated raiders. For skilled fighters, this job offered steady income, without the constant risk of being hunted as criminals. Some guards became legends along the trade routes. Their names spread between caravanserais and desert towns. Merchants actively tried to hire them because their presence alone discouraged attacks. Bandits preferred easier targets. If a caravan travelled with well-known fighters, raiders sometimes chose to wait for the next caravan instead. Fighting professionals meant injuries, dead horses, and possibly failure. And bandits, like merchants, preferred business ventures that ended with profit rather than disaster. So the Silk Road developed its own strange balance. Merchants hired warriors to defend their wealth. Warriors gained fame protecting the caravans. And somewhere out in the desert, bandits quietly waited for a caravan that looked just a little less dangerous. After weeks of travelling through empty deserts and lonely mountain passes, a caravan approaching a caravanserai felt something close to relief. A caravanserai was essentially the Silk Road's version of a fortified roadside hotel. Massive stone walls surrounded a large courtyard where camels, horses, and merchants could rest safely for the night. These buildings were scattered along the major trade routes across Persia, Central Asia, and the Middle East, often placed about a day's journey apart. And for travellers who had spent days worrying about bandits, those thick walls were a beautiful sight. As a caravan approached the gate, the guards of the caravanserai would open the heavy wooden doors and allow the travellers inside. Once the animals and goods were safely within the courtyard, the gates were shut and barred. Anyone arriving late had to wait outside until morning. Inside the walls, life briefly returned to something resembling normal civilization. Camels knelt and groaned as they were unloaded. Merchants stretched their stiff legs and immediately began discussing trade, gossip, and rumours from distant cities. Water wells allowed travellers to refill their supplies. Small kitchens or market stalls sometimes sold bread, soup or dried meat to hungry travellers who had grown tired of desert rations. Caravanserais also served as important centres of information. Travellers exchanged news about the road ahead. Which passes were safe? Which routes were plagued by raiders? Which oasis towns had reliable water and which had recently been attacked? For merchants planning long journeys, this information could mean the difference between profit and disaster. Sometimes caravans even merged here. A small group of merchants arriving from one direction might join a larger caravan heading toward the same destination. The larger the group, the safer the journey usually became. Bandits preferred attacking isolated caravans rather than massive convoys guarded by dozens of armed riders. Of course, caravanserais were not perfect sanctuaries. Bandits occasionally spied on them from nearby hills, watching for wealthy caravans preparing to depart. Informants might quietly report which merchants were carrying silk or silver. Once the caravan left the safety of the walls, the desert once again belonged to whoever controlled it. Still, these roadside fortresses played a crucial role in Silk Road trade. They allowed merchants to travel enormous distances by providing secure resting points along dangerous routes. Without them, many caravans might never have dared cross the deserts at all, because even the bravest merchant appreciated one simple luxury after weeks on the road, sleeping somewhere that bandits could not easily reach. Despite all precautions, even the most experienced caravans sometimes met disaster on the Silk Road. A merchant might spend years building his fortune. He negotiated with suppliers, purchased silk in Chinese cities, loaded camels with spices from India, and assembled a caravan large enough to cross Central Asia safely. Months of travel followed. Deserts, mountains, endless dust, and the constant fear of attack. Then, in a single night, everything could vanish. Silk Road history is filled with stories of caravans that disappeared almost completely. Some were lost to storms or harsh terrain, but others fell victim to large, organized bandit raids. These attacks were not quick strikes by small groups of thieves. Instead, dozens or even hundreds of riders sometimes surrounded a caravan, overwhelming its guards before they could mount an effective defense. When this happened, the results could be devastating. Bandits seized the camels first. Controlling the animals meant controlling the cargo. Silk, silver, jade, spices, and other valuable goods were quickly redistributed among the raiders. What could not be carried away was often destroyed or abandoned in the desert. For the merchants, the loss was catastrophic. Unlike modern traders, Silk Road merchants rarely had insurance or financial safety nets. If a caravan carrying a merchant's goods was destroyed, the investment could disappear completely. Years of savings, borrowed money, and partnerships might collapse overnight. Some merchants were ruined permanently. Others attempted to rebuild, borrowing funds from wealthy families or trading houses in major cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, or Baghdad. But even successful merchants never forgot how fragile their fortunes truly were. In many cases, the raiders themselves quickly sold the stolen goods. Silk might appear weeks later in distant markets under entirely new ownership. A Persian trader might unknowingly purchase fabric that had been taken during an ambush hundreds of miles away. The Silk Road was complicated that way. Trade flowed constantly, but the origins of goods often became blurred as they passed through multiple hands. A merchant buying silk in one city rarely knew the entire journey that fabric had taken. What mattered most was survival, because every caravan travelling the Silk Road understood the same uncomfortable truth. The road offered enormous wealth to those who completed the journey. But for those who failed, the desert kept the profits, and sometimes the travellers themselves. Long before satellites, weather apps, and cheerful television meteorologists pointing at colourful maps, ancient people relied on something far simpler and far more uncertain. They watched the sky. For most civilizations, agriculture formed the backbone of survival. Wheat, barley, rice, maize, and countless other crops depended entirely on the delicate balance between rain, sunlight, and seasonal temperatures. Too little rain meant drought. Too much rain meant floods that drowned fields and destroyed harvests. A cold snap at the wrong time could kill young plants overnight. And there was no backup plan. Ancient farmers could not check next week's forecast. They could not irrigate thousands of acres using modern machinery. If the weather turned against them, entire communities faced hunger. So people began studying patterns in nature with extraordinary attention. They watched the movement of clouds, the direction of winds, the timing of sunrise and sunset, and the behavior of animals. Over generations, these observations slowly turned into practical systems for predicting weather. Some of these methods were surprisingly accurate. In Mesopotamia, observers carefully recorded cloud formations and storms along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Egyptian priests watched the stars and linked celestial movements to seasonal flooding of the Nile. Farmers in the Andes studied mountain winds and animal behavior to anticipate rain or frost. To modern eyes, some of these methods may look like superstition, but they were actually early forms of environmental science. Ancient people did not have thermometers or satellites, but they did have patience. A farmer might notice that certain cloud shapes often appeared before rainstorms. A shepherd might observe that animals behaved differently when pressure in the atmosphere changed. These small clues slowly built a kind of practical knowledge passed down through generations. Entire cultures became skilled readers of the natural world. Priests, scholars, and experienced farmers were often responsible for interpreting these signs. In some societies, predicting the weather became closely tied to religion. If a priest correctly predicted seasonal rains, it reinforced the belief that the gods were communicating through the sky. And when predictions failed, well, people sometimes blamed the gods anyway. But regardless of belief, the stakes were always enormous. Because in the ancient world, predicting the weather was not about convenience. It was about survival. Among the earliest and most systematic weather observers were the ancient Babylonians of Mesopotamia. Living between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, they occupied a land where agriculture flourished, but only if the delicate balance of rain, river flooding, and seasonal temperatures behaved properly. Too much water could destroy crops. Too little meant drought. So the Babylonians developed a habit that would eventually shape both astronomy and early meteorology. They wrote everything down. Priests and scholars working in temple complexes carefully recorded observations of the sky on clay tablets. These records included the movements of the sun, moon, and planets, but also far more everyday details: cloud patterns, winds, storms, and unusual atmospheric events. To them, the sky was not random. It was a system full of signs. Babylonian scholars believed the heavens communicated messages from the gods, but this belief pushed them to observe nature with incredible discipline. If certain cloud formations appeared before rain, they noted it. If strong winds arrived after particular types of clouds, that pattern was recorded too. Over time, these observations formed one of the earliest attempts at weather prediction. One famous collection of Babylonian omens, known today as Enuma Anu Enlil, contained hundreds of recorded sky observations. While much of the text focused on astrology and divine messages, it also preserved descriptions of real atmospheric patterns. For example, certain cloud shapes were linked with approaching storms. Halo rings around the moon were believed to signal rain or strong winds. The direction of winds during sunrise or sunset was also carefully watched, as it often hinted at incoming weather changes. Some predictions even relied on seasonal rhythms. Babylonian farmers knew that certain types of clouds appearing in particular months often preceded seasonal rains. The priests who tracked these patterns became valuable advisors for agriculture. If the sky suggested a dry season ahead, farmers might adjust planting times or prepare irrigation systems. In other words, early weather prediction had practical value. Of course, not every Babylonian forecast was accurate. Their understanding of atmospheric science was limited, and religious interpretations sometimes mixed with real observations. But the key achievement was the method itself. They were studying patterns. By observing the sky night after night, year after year, Babylonian scholars began turning weather into something that could be anticipated rather than feared blindly. It was not modern meteorology. but it was one of the first serious attempts in human history to understand what the sky was about to do next. While the Babylonians watched clouds and winds, the ancient Egyptians looked upward for a different kind of signal. They watched the stars. Egypt's survival depended almost entirely on the Nile River. Each year the river flooded, spreading rich black silt across the surrounding farmland. This natural irrigation system allowed Egyptian agriculture to flourish in a land otherwise surrounded by desert. But the Nile's flood was not perfectly predictable. If the waters rose too little, crops failed and famine followed. If the flood rose too high, villages and fields could be destroyed. Farmers therefore needed some way to anticipate when the river would rise. Their solution came from the night sky. Egyptian astronomer priests carefully observed the heliacal rising of certain stars. This event occurred when a star first became visible in the eastern sky just before sunrise, after a period of being hidden behind the sun. One particular star became incredibly important: Sirius. Known to the Egyptians as Sopdet, Sirius appeared in the dawn sky each year just before the annual Nile flood began. The timing was so consistent that the star's appearance became a natural calendar marker. When Sirius rose in the early morning sky, Egyptians knew the life-giving flood was approaching. This observation allowed farmers to prepare their fields. Irrigation canals could be cleared, storage buildings could be readied, workers could move livestock and equipment away from low floodplains. In essence, the rising of Sirius served as an early seasonal forecast. Egyptian priests also watched other celestial patterns. The movements of constellations helped structure the Egyptian calendar, which divided the year into agricultural seasons tied closely to the Nile's behavior. These seasons included the flooding period, the growing season, and the harvest. Astronomy and agriculture became deeply connected. The priests responsible for observing the sky held enormous authority. Their ability to announce the coming flood reinforced their status as interpreters of divine order. To many Egyptians, the stars were not simply distant objects. They were part of a cosmic system created by the gods to maintain balance on Earth. And in a sense, they were correct. The appearance of Sirius truly did correspond with seasonal changes caused by complex interactions between rainfall far upstream in the Nile basin and the timing of Earth's orbit around the Sun. The Egyptians did not know the physics behind these cycles, but they knew the pattern, and by reading the sky with patience and discipline, they learned to anticipate one of the most important natural events in the ancient world. While farmers across the ancient world relied on observation and tradition, the Greeks began asking a slightly different question. Why did the weather behave the way it did? Greek thinkers were among the first to move beyond simple observation and attempt to explain the mechanisms behind storms, winds, and seasonal changes. Instead of treating weather purely as a message from the gods, they tried to understand it as part of the natural world. This was a revolutionary idea. One of the most influential figures in this early scientific effort was the philosopher Aristotle. In the 4th century before Christ, he wrote a work called Meteorologica, one of the earliest attempts to systematically explain weather and atmospheric phenomena. Aristotle believed the atmosphere was shaped by the interaction of 4 basic elements: earth, water, air, and fire. Although modern science has replaced this model, the important part was the method he used. He tried to explain weather logically. In Meteorologica, Aristotle discussed winds, clouds, rain, hail, thunder, lightning, and even comets and shooting stars. He proposed that the sun's heat caused moisture to rise from the earth, forming clouds in the sky. When these clouds cooled, they released rain. It was not entirely correct, but it was surprisingly close to the modern concept of evaporation and condensation. Aristotle also attempted to categorize winds. Greek sailors depended heavily on understanding wind patterns in the Mediterranean Sea. By studying how winds behaved during different seasons, Greek scholars tried to identify predictable cycles. Some winds even received names. The Boreas, a cold wind from the north, often brought storms and colder weather. The Notos, blowing from the south, was associated with rain. Sailors and farmers learned to associate these wind directions with changing weather conditions. Greek writers also produced some of the earliest weather guides for everyday people. One famous example came from Theophrastus, a student of Aristotle. In his work on weather signs, he collected dozens of observations used to predict weather changes. These included signs such as unusual cloud shapes, halos around the moon, changes in wind direction, and even animal behavior. For instance, if swallows flew low to the ground, rain might be approaching. If the moon appeared surrounded by a glowing ring, storms could follow. These signs became widely known throughout the Greek world. The Greeks did not have modern instruments or mathematical weather models, but their curiosity pushed them toward a new approach. Instead of simply accepting the sky as mysterious, they began trying to understand it. And that curiosity would eventually lay the intellectual foundation for meteorology thousands of years later. While Greek philosophers tried to explain the science behind weather, the Romans approached the problem from a far more practical angle. They wanted signs that actually worked in the field. Roman agriculture fed one of the largest empires the ancient world had ever seen. Grain from Italy, North Africa, and Egypt supplied cities filled with hundreds of thousands of people. If the harvest failed, food shortages could quickly turn into riots. So Roman farmers paid very close attention to the sky. Much of their knowledge was recorded in agricultural manuals written by Roman authors. One of the most famous examples came from the poet Virgil, whose work Georgics offered practical advice about farming, weather, and seasonal rhythms. According to Virgil, nature constantly gave warnings about changing weather if farmers knew how to read the signs. For instance, he wrote that when swallows flew unusually low across fields, rain was likely approaching. The explanation, though unknown at the time, involved air pressure and insect behavior. In humid conditions before rainstorms, insects fly lower to the ground, and birds naturally follow their food. Roman farmers simply noticed the pattern. Another common sign involved the moon. If the moon appeared surrounded by a pale ring of light, storms might arrive soon. Today we know that such halos are caused by ice crystals in high clouds that often precede incoming weather systems. The Romans had no idea about ice crystals in the upper atmosphere, but they knew the ring meant rain might be coming. Animal behavior provided many other clues. If cattle suddenly became restless or gathered closely together, farmers suspected a storm was approaching. Frogs croaking loudly at night were also believed to signal wet weather. Even insects played a role in weather prediction. Roman writers claimed that ants carrying eggs out of their nests could indicate upcoming rain. This behavior sometimes happens when insects detect rising moisture in the soil before storms arrive. Some Roman signs were more poetic than scientific. A bright red sunset was often taken as a sign of good weather the following day. Interestingly, this idea survived into modern folklore as the saying, "Red sky at night, shepherd's delight." And sometimes these observations were surprisingly accurate. Roman farmers may not have understood atmospheric science, but generations of careful observation helped them recognize patterns in nature. For people whose survival depended entirely on successful harvests, even small clues could make a huge difference. Because in the ancient world, predicting the weather was not a hobby. It was a matter of feeding an empire. High in the Andes Mountains of South America, ancient farmers faced a weather problem very different from those of Mesopotamia or the Mediterranean. At high altitudes, the climate could change suddenly and violently. A clear morning could become a freezing storm by afternoon. Frost could destroy crops overnight. Rain might arrive weeks earlier than expected, or vanish entirely during crucial planting seasons. For Andean farmers growing potatoes, maize, and quinoa on steep mountain terraces, predicting these shifts was essential. So they watched the animals. One of the most famous examples involved llamas and alpacas, animals central to Andean life. Herdsmen noticed that when these animals clustered tightly together or sought shelter unusually early, bad weather often followed. The animals seemed to sense approaching storms long before humans noticed any change in the sky. Birds also became important weather indicators. Certain Andean birds changed their flight patterns depending on atmospheric conditions. When birds flew unusually low or moved towards sheltered valleys, farmers sometimes interpreted this as a warning of strong winds or storms approaching the mountains. But perhaps the most remarkable weather signal came from frogs. In the Andean highlands, farmers observed that frogs became far more active before rainfall. Their calls grew louder and more frequent in the evenings when humid weather approached. Today, scientists know that amphibians are extremely sensitive to moisture and atmospheric pressure changes, which can influence their behavior before storms. Ancient Andean farmers did not know the science behind it, but they knew the pattern. Another fascinating predictor involved the Pleiades star cluster, visible in the night sky. Farmers watched how clearly these stars appeared during certain times of the year. If the stars looked bright and sharp, it was believed that the coming growing season would bring good rains. If the stars appeared dim or hazy, drought might follow. Modern researchers studying this tradition discovered something remarkable. Thin, high-altitude clouds sometimes obscure the stars slightly. These clouds can be linked to large-scale climate patterns affecting rainfall months later. In other words, ancient Andean farmers were unknowingly detecting early signs of seasonal weather patterns. Their method was not superstition. It was careful environmental observation refined over centuries. In the harsh mountain landscapes of the Andes, predicting weather could mean the difference between a successful harvest and widespread hunger. And by listening to animals, watching the stars, and studying the mountains themselves, these farmers developed one of the most sophisticated traditional forecasting systems in the ancient world. In ancient China, predicting the weather became a serious intellectual pursuit, closely tied to agriculture, government authority, and cosmic philosophy. The Chinese Empire depended heavily on stable harvests. Rice, millet, and wheat fed enormous populations, and a single season of failed crops could trigger famine or unrest. Because of this, emperors and officials paid close attention to any method that might help anticipate weather patterns. Chinese scholars believed that nature followed cycles that could be observed and understood. Early Chinese texts describe careful monitoring of winds, clouds, seasonal temperatures, and rainfall. Farmers watched the sky for specific cloud shapes that often preceded storms. Thin streaks of clouds stretching across the sky could signal approaching rain, while towering dark clouds hinted at violent thunderstorms. Wind direction was especially important. Certain winds were associated with seasonal changes. Warm southern winds could bring moisture and rainfall, while dry northern winds often carried cold air from the vast Asian interior. Experienced farmers learned to interpret these shifts as signs that weather was about to change. Chinese observers also paid close attention to fog and dew. Heavy morning dew was sometimes taken as a sign of stable weather, while thick fog might indicate a coming change in temperature or rain. Farmers studying their fields every day became skilled at noticing these subtle patterns. Beyond simple observation, Chinese philosophy connected weather to the broader balance of the universe. According to the concept of yin and yang, natural forces constantly shifted between opposing energies. Yin represented cold, darkness, and moisture, while yang represented warmth, light, and dryness. Weather patterns were seen as expressions of this balance. If droughts or floods occurred, they were sometimes interpreted as signs that harmony between these forces had been disrupted. Chinese scholars also developed early seasonal calendars designed to guide farming activities. These calendars divided the year into agricultural periods that reflected expected weather changes. Farmers used these divisions to plan planting, irrigation, and harvests. Perhaps most importantly, Chinese record keepers documented weather events carefully. Imperial officials recorded floods, droughts, and unusual storms in historical archives. Over time, these records helped scholars identify recurring patterns in rainfall and seasonal climate. While they lacked modern meteorological instruments, Chinese observers built an impressive body of knowledge through patient study of nature. For them, predicting the weather was not only practical, it was also part of understanding how the entire universe maintained balance between sky, earth, and human life. For ancient sailors, predicting the weather was not just important for crops or harvests. It could mean the difference between arriving safely in port or disappearing beneath the waves. Across the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, and the vast Pacific, sailors learned to read the sky and sea with extraordinary attention. Without modern instruments, they relied entirely on natural signs to anticipate storms, winds, and changing conditions. One of the most important signals came from cloud formations. Experienced sailors could recognize cloud patterns that often appeared before storms. High, thin clouds spreading across the sky sometimes meant that a large weather system was approaching. Dark, towering clouds on the horizon warned of sudden storms that could bring violent winds and dangerous waves. A calm sea could turn deadly within hours. Wind behavior also provided valuable clues. Sailors watched how breezes shifted throughout the day. In many coastal regions, winds followed daily cycles. Gentle winds from the sea during the afternoon and winds from land during the night helped sailors anticipate weather patterns during their journeys. But if the wind suddenly shifted direction or intensified unexpectedly, experienced captains grew cautious. It often meant something larger was approaching. The color of the sky also became an important signal. A deep red sunset sometimes suggested stable weather the next day. This phenomenon occurs when sunlight passes through dry air filled with dust particles, scattering red light across the horizon. Ancient sailors did not know the physics, but they trusted the sign. The phrase, "red sky at night, sailor's delight," has roots stretching back thousands of years. Conversely, a red sky in the morning could signal approaching storms carried by winds moving toward the observer. Animal behavior also played a role at sea. Seabirds often flew inland before strong storms. Fishermen noticed that when birds suddenly abandoned coastal waters, rough weather might follow. Fish sometimes behaved differently as well, diving deeper when atmospheric pressure changed before storms. Even the smell of the air could provide warnings. Some sailors claimed they could smell rain or approaching storms long before clouds appeared. Changes in humidity and wind direction sometimes carried scents from distant land or incoming rain systems. To modern observers, these methods might seem uncertain, but ancient sailors spent their entire lives studying the sea and sky. Their survival depended on noticing subtle patterns most people would ignore. Because when you are hundreds of miles from shore in a wooden ship, predicting the weather becomes far more than curiosity. It becomes the difference between life and death. Across the ancient world, weather prediction was never perfect. Babylonian priests studying clouds, Egyptian astronomers watching the rising of Sirius, Roman farmers listening to frogs, Andean shepherds observing their animals, and Chinese scholars recording winds were all trying to solve the same problem. The sky was unpredictable, but even imperfect predictions were incredibly valuable. In agricultural societies, timing meant everything. Plant seeds too early and frost might kill the crops. Plant too late and the harvest might not mature before the cold season returned. If farmers could anticipate rain or drought even a few weeks ahead, they could make decisions that protected their food supply. And food meant survival. Entire civilizations rose or struggled based on their ability to manage weather risks. When seasonal rains arrived as expected, harvests were abundant. Cities grew larger, trade expanded, and governments became stable. But when weather patterns shifted unexpectedly, disaster often followed. History records numerous examples of droughts and floods, triggering famine, migration, and political instability. Ancient rulers understood this connection very well. Many kings and emperors believed their authority depended on maintaining harmony between heaven and earth. If crops failed repeatedly, people sometimes believed the ruler had lost divine favor. Because of this belief, weather prediction and observation often became official duties within governments. Priests, scholars, and astronomers were tasked with watching the skies and interpreting natural signs. Their forecasts helped guide planting seasons, irrigation planning, and grain storage. Even imperfect knowledge was better than none. What makes these ancient systems remarkable is how often they were based on real environmental patterns. Observing animals before storms, tracking seasonal star movements, or studying cloud shapes were all early attempts to recognize repeating natural signals. These observations were the first steps toward meteorology. Of course, modern science has transformed weather forecasting. Satellites monitor cloud systems across the entire planet. Supercomputers analyze atmospheric data to predict storms days in advance. Farmers can check detailed forecasts on their phones before deciding when to plant. But the basic human instinct remains the same. We still look to the sky and ask the same question our ancestors once asked while standing in dusty fields or on mountain terraces. What is the weather going to do next? And thousands of years ago, when harvests and survival depended entirely on that answer, people became some of the most patient observers the sky had ever known. By the early 1930s, Al Capone had become one of the most powerful and infamous men in America. Chicago, a booming and chaotic city during the era of Prohibition, had effectively become his personal kingdom. Through bootlegging, gambling, and organized crime, Capone's syndicate controlled an enormous underground economy built on illegal alcohol. The United States government had outlawed the sale and distribution of alcohol in 1920 through the 18th Amendment. The intention was to reduce crime and moral decline. Instead, it created a goldmine for organized crime. Speakeasies appeared across American cities almost overnight. These hidden bars served illegal liquor to customers eager to ignore the law. Someone had to supply that liquor, and in Chicago, that someone was usually Al Capone. His organization smuggled alcohol from Canada, operated secret breweries, and distributed liquor through a network of trucks and warehouses. The profits were enormous. Capone's operation reportedly earned tens of millions of dollars each year, making him one of the richest criminals in the country. But Capone did not rule Chicago quietly. Violence followed his business empire everywhere. Rival gangs fought for territory, and the city saw frequent shootings, bombings, and assassinations connected to organized crime. The most notorious example came in 1929 during the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, when 7 members of a rival gang were executed inside a garage. Although Capone was widely believed to be behind the attack, proving it in court was another matter entirely. Witnesses were often too frightened to testify. Evidence disappeared. Police officers and city officials were sometimes bribed or intimidated. Prosecutors repeatedly struggled to link Capone directly to violent crimes. For years, he appeared untouchable. Yet Capone also cultivated a strange public image. He donated food to the poor during the Depression, and sometimes portrayed himself as a businessman, simply providing a service people wanted. To many Americans, he seemed less like a villain and more like a rebellious celebrity who openly defied unpopular laws. But behind the expensive suits and charming smiles stood a ruthless criminal network responsible for enormous violence. Federal authorities knew this. The challenge was proving it. By 1931, investigators had spent years trying to bring down Capone through murder charges, conspiracy cases, and racketeering investigations. None of them had succeeded. So the government began looking for a different weapon. And ironically, the man who had survived gang wars, police raids, and countless criminal accusations was about to face something far less dramatic. An audit. By the late 1920s, federal authorities had reached a frustrating conclusion about Al Capone. Everyone knew he was a criminal. They just could not prove it. Chicago police had investigated Capone for years. Witnesses described shootings, bombings, and gang assassinations tied to his organization. Rival gang members were murdered with disturbing regularity. Entire neighborhoods knew which speakeasies, gambling houses, and brothels belonged to Capone's network. But knowing and proving were two very different things. Witnesses disappeared. Some were bribed. Others were simply too terrified to testify against one of the most feared crime bosses in America. Police raids occasionally shut down illegal operations, but the businesses quickly reopened under new management. Capone himself carefully stayed removed from the actual violence. He rarely pulled the trigger. Instead, orders moved quietly through layers of loyal lieutenants. By the time investigators tried to connect a crime to Capone directly, the evidence had usually vanished. For federal prosecutors, this created an enormous problem. They needed a crime they could prove in court. That opportunity appeared through a legal principle established by the United States Supreme Court in 1927. The court ruled that income earned illegally was still subject to taxation. In other words, criminals were required to report their illegal profits to the government and pay taxes on them. This created a strange loophole. If the government could prove that Capone had earned large amounts of money and failed to report it, he could be charged with tax evasion. It was not as dramatic as murder charges or racketeering conspiracies, but it was a crime that relied on financial records rather than frightened witnesses. And numbers were harder to intimidate. The Internal Revenue Service, along with federal investigators, began quietly assembling evidence. They searched for bank records, business documents, gambling ledgers, and testimony from people who had handled money within Capone's organization. One of the key figures in this investigation was Frank Wilson, a meticulous government accountant. Wilson was not a detective chasing gangsters through Chicago streets. Instead, he spent long hours studying financial documents, tracing money through complicated networks of shell businesses and hidden accounts. Piece by piece, the investigators built their case. They did not need to prove Capone had ordered murders. They only needed to prove one simple fact: that the most powerful gangster in America had made enormous amounts of money and never paid taxes on it. It was a surprisingly quiet strategy, but it would soon lead to one of the most famous courtroom battles in American history. If Al Capone had one weakness, it was money. His criminal empire generated enormous profits. Bootlegging operations, illegal breweries, gambling houses, and protection rackets poured cash into the organization every day. Truckloads of liquor moved through Chicago. Speakeasies paid regular fees for protection. Gambling rooms collected bets from thousands of customers. Some estimates suggested Capone's syndicate earned more than $100 million a year. The problem was that none of it appeared on his tax returns. Capone publicly claimed he had no official job. When questioned by authorities, he often insisted that he lived off gambling winnings or generous gifts from friends. Without clear financial records, proving otherwise was difficult. But the federal investigators believed the truth was hiding somewhere in the numbers. This is where government accountant Frank Wilson became crucial to the investigation. Unlike detectives chasing gangsters through smoky nightclubs, Wilson spent most of his time quietly examining documents. He searched for ledgers, bank deposits, payroll lists, and gambling records connected to Capone's businesses. And eventually, he found something important. During a raid on illegal gambling operations linked to Capone's organization, investigators recovered financial ledgers from a betting house. These documents recorded payments made to employees and managers working within the criminal enterprise. One entry caught Wilson's attention. The ledger listed payments to someone identified as Alphonse Capone. It was a small detail, but it was exactly what the government needed. If Capone was receiving regular payments from illegal operations, that meant he was earning taxable income. Wilson began tracing these payments carefully. He compared the gambling records with other financial documents collected during the investigation. Slowly, the picture became clearer. Capone might not have signed official contracts or registered legitimate businesses, but the money flowing through his organization could still be tracked. And none of it had been reported to the federal government. The evidence was not dramatic like a smoking gun or a murder weapon. Instead, it consisted of columns of numbers, names written in pencil, and financial records quietly connecting Capone to the profits of his criminal empire. But in a courtroom, that kind of evidence could be powerful. Unlike witnesses, numbers could not be intimidated. By 1931, prosecutors believed they finally had enough proof to charge Capone with multiple counts of tax evasion. It was not the crime the public expected, but it might finally bring down the most powerful gangster in America. And soon, Capone would find himself facing something he had rarely experienced before: a judge. By the summer of 1931, the federal government believed it finally had Al Capone cornered. For years he had slipped through the fingers of law enforcement. Murder investigations collapsed. Witnesses refused to speak. Police raids shut down operations only temporarily. Capone's empire always seemed to recover. But the tax case was different. It did not rely on frightened witnesses or secret informants hiding from gang retaliation. It relied on financial records, payment ledgers, and the simple fact that Capone had earned enormous amounts of money without reporting it to the government. In June 1931, a federal grand jury in Chicago delivered the moment prosecutors had been waiting for. Al Capone was formally indicted on 22 counts of tax evasion. The charges alleged that Capone had earned hundreds of thousands of dollars between 1925 and 1929 without filing proper income tax returns. Under federal law, this was a serious crime carrying the possibility of significant prison time. The news spread across the country almost immediately. Newspapers printed headlines announcing that the most notorious gangster in America was finally facing trial. For many Americans, Capone symbolized the chaos of the Prohibition era. Organized crime had flourished while law enforcement struggled to keep up. Now, at last, the government seemed ready to challenge him in court. Capone himself reacted with surprising calm. Publicly, he insisted the charges were ridiculous. He claimed he had no formal income and therefore owed no taxes. To reporters, he joked about the situation and continued presenting himself as a confident businessman rather than a criminal boss. Behind the scenes, however, the situation was far more serious. Capone assembled a powerful legal team led by skilled defense attorneys who specialized in complex criminal cases. Their strategy was simple: weaken the government's evidence and challenge the credibility of the financial records. If they could convince the jury that the ledgers were unreliable or that Capone had not personally received the money listed in them, the entire case might collapse. But the government had also prepared carefully. Prosecutors believed their evidence was strong enough to prove Capone's involvement in the illegal income. More importantly, they believed they could present the financial records clearly enough for a jury to understand. For Capone, the upcoming trial would be unlike the violent street battles that had defined his career. There would be no gunmen, no bombings, and no gang rivalries. Instead, the fight would take place inside a courtroom, with lawyers arguing over numbers, documents, and the meaning of a few lines written in a gambling ledger. As the trial approached, Al Capone and his lawyers realized something uncomfortable. The government's case looked stronger than expected. The financial ledgers recovered from gambling houses were difficult to dismiss. The entries clearly listed payments connected to Capone's organization, and investigators were ready to explain exactly how those profits flowed through the criminal network. If the jury believed those records, Capone could face serious prison time. So his legal team attempted a different strategy. They tried to negotiate. Capone's lawyers quietly approached federal prosecutors with the idea of a plea deal. The plan was simple. Capone would admit guilt on a smaller charge related to tax violations in exchange for a lighter sentence. Instead of risking a long prison term after a dramatic trial, he might receive only a few years. At first, Capone seemed confident this approach would work. For years, powerful criminals had often managed to negotiate favorable outcomes. With the right lawyers and enough influence, trials could sometimes end with reduced charges or minimal punishment. Capone expected something similar. In fact, he reportedly believed the deal had already been arranged. When Capone appeared in court in June 1931, he surprised many observers by offering to plead guilty. His lawyers indicated that he was prepared to accept a relatively short sentence, possibly just a couple of years in prison. But something unexpected happened. The presiding judge, James Herbert Wilkerson, refused to accept the agreement. Judge Wilkerson had carefully reviewed the case and was not interested in allowing Capone to quietly escape a full trial. The charges were serious, and the evidence suggested years of deliberate tax evasion. If Capone wanted to plead guilty, the judge made clear the sentence might be far harsher than the one his lawyers expected. Suddenly, the situation changed. Capone's legal team quickly withdrew the guilty plea. Instead of risking a severe sentence immediately, they decided to proceed with the trial and challenge the government's evidence in front of a jury. The courtroom drama was now unavoidable. For the first time, the federal government would present its full case against the most famous gangster in America. Prosecutors were confident their financial evidence would hold up under scrutiny. Capone, meanwhile, relied on his lawyers to dismantle that evidence piece by piece. What had begun as a quiet tax investigation was about to become a national spectacle. Newspapers across the country prepared to cover every moment. Because the trial of Al Capone was no longer just a legal case. It had become a showdown between the American government and organized crime itself. As Al Capone's trial prepared to begin in October 1931, his legal team believed they had one powerful advantage: the jury. In many criminal trials of the era, organized crime figures often managed to influence juries through intimidation, bribery, or quiet pressure. Chicago in the Prohibition era was a city where Capone's reputation carried enormous weight. People knew what happened to those who crossed him. Capone's lawyers were confident they could identify jurors who might sympathize with the defense, or at least hesitate to convict such a powerful man. But Judge James Herbert Wilkerson had anticipated this possibility, and he had a plan. When jury selection began, Capone's attorneys carefully questioned potential jurors, trying to detect any sign of bias or hostility. Meanwhile, federal prosecutors watched closely, preparing to challenge jurors they believed might favor the defense. Everything appeared to proceed normally, but just before the trial officially began, Judge Wilkerson made an unexpected decision. He quietly ordered that the entire jury panel be replaced with jurors from a different federal case that had already been selected earlier in the day. The swap happened suddenly. Capone's lawyers had spent hours examining and evaluating the first group of jurors, hoping to shape the jury in their favor. Now, those efforts were completely useless. The new jury had been chosen for another trial entirely, meaning Capone's defense team had no time to influence or carefully analyze the group. The judge's reasoning was clear. He suspected that Capone's organization might attempt to tamper with the jury. By replacing the panel at the last moment, he eliminated the opportunity for bribery or intimidation before the trial began. For Capone's lawyers, the move was a major setback. They had expected to enter the trial with at least some control over jury selection. Instead, they faced a group of citizens chosen under circumstances they had not prepared for. Newspapers quickly reported the judge's maneuver. To the public, it looked like a bold step to protect the integrity of the trial. After years of gang violence and corruption associated with Capone's empire, many Americans were eager to see a fair and decisive verdict. Inside the courtroom, however, the tension grew. Prosecutors prepared their financial evidence. Defense attorneys sharpened their arguments. And the newly selected jurors took their seats, fully aware that they were about to judge the most famous criminal figure in the country. The trial had officially begun. And for the first time in his career, Al Capone could not control what happened next. Once the trial began, the government presented its case carefully and methodically. Prosecutors knew they were not trying to prove murders, gang wars, or bootlegging operations. Their goal was far simpler. They needed to show that Al Capone had earned income and never paid taxes on it. To do that, the prosecution focused heavily on the gambling ledgers discovered during earlier raids. These records contained lists of payments made to various individuals involved in Capone's criminal network. Among the names written in the ledgers was Alphonse Capone. The prosecution argued that these entries showed Capone receiving profits from illegal gambling operations. If those payments were real income, Capone was legally required to report them to the government and pay taxes. He had not done so. The key challenge was convincing the jury that the records were legitimate and connected directly to Capone himself. To explain the complicated financial trail, prosecutors relied heavily on the work of government accountant Frank Wilson. Wilson took the stand and carefully walked the jury through the evidence step by step. He explained how investigators had found the ledgers during raids on gambling houses connected to Capone's organization. He described how the payments listed in the books matched the structure of the criminal operation. And most importantly, he showed how those payments appeared to be directed to Capone. Wilson's testimony was calm and precise. He was not a dramatic witness delivering shocking accusations. Instead, he presented the numbers in a straightforward way, helping the jury understand how the money flowed through the gambling operations. The defense immediately attacked the evidence. Capone's lawyers argued that the ledgers could not be trusted. They claimed the records might have been written by someone else, misinterpreted by investigators, or even fabricated. After all, the documents did not contain Capone's signature. Anyone could have written his name in a ledger. The defense also suggested that Capone himself had no official role in the gambling operations. Even if money had moved through the businesses, that did not necessarily prove the gangster personally received it. The courtroom arguments became a battle of credibility. Were the financial records accurate? Or were they simply scraps of paper that investigators were trying to twist into a criminal case? For the jurors, the decision would come down to one question. Did the numbers tell the truth about Al Capone's hidden fortune? After days of testimony, arguments, and endless examination of financial records, the trial of Al Capone finally reached its most dramatic moment. The case was now in the hands of the jury. 12 ordinary citizens had listened as prosecutors explained how Capone's criminal empire generated enormous profits through gambling and bootlegging. They had heard the careful testimony of accountant Frank Wilson, who traced the money recorded in the gambling ledgers. They had also listened to Capone's defense attorney's attempt to dismantle the evidence and argue that the financial records were unreliable. Now those jurors had to decide whether the government had proven its case. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Capone sat quietly beside his lawyers, dressed as always in an expensive suit. For years he had faced danger from rival gangs, police raids, and countless criminal investigations. But this moment was different. For once, the outcome was completely out of his control. The jury left the courtroom to begin deliberations. Outside, reporters crowded the courthouse hallways. The trial had become national news. Americans across the country followed every update, eager to see whether the government could finally defeat one of the most notorious criminals in modern history. But the jury did not take long. After only a short period of discussion, the jurors returned to the courtroom with their decision. Al Capone was found guilty on multiple counts of tax evasion. The verdict shocked many observers, not because Capone had been convicted, but because it had happened at all. For years, he had seemed immune to prosecution. Witnesses vanished, evidence disappeared, charges collapsed. Yet now the most powerful gangster in Chicago had been defeated by something far less dramatic than a gang war. Paperwork. The financial records had convinced the jury that Capone had received large sums of income and deliberately failed to report them to the government. Under federal law, that was enough to secure a conviction. The courtroom remained silent as the verdict was read. Capone showed little visible reaction, but the meaning was clear. For the first time, the man who had dominated Chicago's criminal world was now officially a convicted felon. But one crucial moment still remained. The sentencing. And the judge overseeing the case was about to deliver a punishment far harsher than Capone had ever expected. With the guilty verdict delivered, the final chapter of the trial arrived. Sentencing. Many people, including Capone himself, still believed the punishment might be relatively light. After all, the conviction was for tax evasion, not murder or organized crime. Capone's lawyers had hoped the sentence might be limited to a few years in prison, perhaps followed by fines. But Judge James Herbert Wilkerson had a different view. When the courtroom gathered for sentencing in October 1931, the judge made it clear that Capone's crimes were not minor financial mistakes. For years, he had deliberately concealed enormous amounts of income while building a criminal empire fueled by violence and corruption. The law might have caught him through taxes, but the judge understood the larger context. This was not an ordinary defendant. After reviewing the charges, Judge Wilkerson delivered the sentence. Al Capone was ordered to serve 11 years in federal prison, pay heavy fines, and cover the costs of prosecution. At the time, it was one of the harshest sentences ever given for tax evasion in American history. The message was unmistakable. Even the most powerful gangster in the country was not above the law. For Capone, the sentence marked the beginning of a dramatic fall from power. The man who had once ruled Chicago's criminal underworld with fear and wealth was now a prisoner of the federal government. At first, Capone was sent to the federal penitentiary in Atlanta, but authorities soon realized he still held influence over other inmates and possibly even guards. To prevent him from continuing to control criminal operations from prison, the government transferred him to a new and far more isolated facility, Alcatraz. Located on a rocky island in San Francisco Bay, Alcatraz was designed to hold the most dangerous and influential criminals in America. Inside its walls, Capone's money and reputation meant very little. Prison life was harsh and strictly controlled. Over the years, Capone's health also began to decline. Untreated syphilis slowly damaged his mind, leaving him weakened and increasingly confused. By the time he was released in 1939, after serving most of his sentence, the once feared gangster was no longer the powerful figure who had dominated Chicago. His empire had collapsed. The trial of Al Capone became one of the most famous moments in American legal history. It proved that even when violence, intimidation, and corruption made traditional prosecutions impossible, the law could still find another path. In Capone's case, that path came through something surprisingly simple: taxes.